good day and welcome to our next episode of Football Transfer Markets. And today we are going to cover Portugal. And our guest today is Mr. Pedro Acevedo Branco from the legal team of FC Porto, one of the greatest clubs of Portugal. And today Mr. Branco will cover domestic regulations of Portugal related to our general topics usually discussed here. So let's start. Dear Pedro, thanks for accepting my invitation and coming to this small event of ours dedicated for sports lawyers, football officials, and other stakeholders in the industry. Before starting, I would like to emphasize for the audience that our guest today is in-house lawyer of the club, which arguably makes him by status as a club official. But in any case, we would like to emphasize that what is being told here, what is being discussed here is a sole opinion of the guest and has nothing to do with the club's official position, official statement, and the information contained herein cannot be used as evidence or cannot be reliable to the extent to start any proceedings, regardless if it's before national court or football alternative dispute resolution bodies or judicial bodies or CAS proceedings. And by continuing to listen or watch this episode, you irrevocably accept this disclaimer here too, and no any information contained here can be used against the club or the guest in entirety, jointly or separately. So Pedro, I suppose we can start. Today's guest is from FC Porto, and Pedro is a member of legal team of FC Porto, and we have privilege to hear about Portuguese domestic football regulations directly from club's representative of one of the best top clubs around the world. So in terms to emphasize and highlight the skills of our guest today. So Pedro, before starting, I would like to say that usually we cover football transfer markets of different countries and jurisdictions. So in order to cover the transfer market entirely, especially after the Aras case, which may arguably trigger some changes at the international level, we cover three topics. The first one is training compensation system at domestic level. Second one is the transfers usually made against payments. In other words, transfer fees which you experienced, which you would like to emphasize in the domestic market when the clubs sign transfer agreements with against fee. We can discuss both when the transfers are being done domestically and when the clubs in the country usually export the player. What are common conditions, which are not common? So, and the third question is there any standard contract form usually enforced or recommended by the league or FA? And the fourth question is left for you to bring about your domestic jurisdiction, which we can discuss together. So thank you once again for coming. So let's start.
Okay, yes. Thank you so much for the invitation, and I take this opportunity to congratulate you on this project. It seems a really different and a really convenient project to our industry. So, starting with the training compensation here in the Portuguese market, we have to make here at the beginning a difference between two situations regarding the training compensation. If the two clubs or more than two clubs involved are both participating in competitions of the Portuguese league, the regulations that will be applied are the league regulations. In case one of the clubs involved are not participating in the Portuguese league competitions, the regulation that will be applied are the Portuguese Football Federation regulations. And the rules are a little bit different. So I will start with the situation when the two clubs involved are participating in the competitions of the Portuguese league. So I will speak about the regulations of the Portuguese league regarding the training compensation. I will let you know first some general principles of the Portuguese league regulations regarding this topic. Of course, the clubs are entitled to receive compensation for the training and promotion of players. And one of the principal rules is that at the end of the contractual relationship, the player can freely choose the club with which he wishes to enter into a training contract or employment contract. And the validity and effectiveness of this new contract are not dependent on the payment of this compensation when it's due. This is to protect the player, besides the discussion between the clubs regarding the payment of the compensation.
Is it related to safeguarding of the freedom of movement, or it has other?
Yeah, in the basis of this principle, yes, it's the free of movement and to protect the player from other questions that are not directly related to the player. This compensation has to be solved between the clubs, and the player cannot be set aside from playing because of this kind of situation. So one of the principles that leads to this rule is the free of movement of players. Yes, and the new club, when he signs the sports employment contract with the player, must inform the previous club in writing no later than 15 days after the signing of the contract that the player sign the contract with the new club. If the new club fails to make this warning to the previous club, the amount of the compensation will be increased by 50%, which is a lot.
This is harsh rule, actually.
Yeah, yeah. Regarding the compensation, the rules that the Portuguese league established are really specific. They say that the amount of compensation should, whenever possible, be agreed between the clubs by means of a contract. And in case the clubs can reach an agreement regarding this compensation, the agreement must be communicated to the Portuguese league no later than 15 days after they signed the agreement. And the compensation after the agreement between the clubs must be paid in 30 days.
Like in FIFA,
Uh,
when
exactly.
registering for the first time. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. One of the cases when this compensation is due is when the player signs the first employment contract, and the conclusion by the player of this first sports employment contract entitles the training clubs to receive the compensation from the new club for training the player, of course. However, this compensation will only be due if two conditions are met. The training club has informed the player by writing by 31 of May of the year in which the training contract ends of its desire to enter into a sports employment contract subject to some minimum conditions. So the point here is that the previous club, to be entitled to receive the compensation, has to make a proposal to the player to the renewal of the contract. Otherwise,
Similar to European Union regulations of FIFA.
exactly, yeah. Otherwise, the club shows that does not have the interest to have the player playing for the club after the end of the contract. And the same previous club has to send to the Portuguese league a copy of the proposal that the club made to the player. These two conditions have to be met for the club to have the right to the compensation.
And who does the clearance in case of the first professional contract? Does the new club make a deposit in the league and the league makes the clearance, or it's from club to club directly?
No. The club that makes the proposal have to inform the league of the
No, I'm asking about payment or when.
payment. Yeah, the
Yeah.
payment is directly between clubs. Yeah,
Okay.
so the new club has to inform the previous club of the signing of the contract, and they can agree on the date of the payment, and the new club has to pay the compensation to the previous club.
Another question which I have, and this will bring us to the second layer of training compensation, which you set outside of the league, is about fees. Why I'm asking about fees? Because recently I was reading the local regulations on status and transfer of players of Portugal Football Federation, and Article 48 and 49
Mhm.
brings us to the system of calculation.
Okay.
And directs us to the official communication number one. And
Exactly.
And when reading this official communication about the amount of the formation fee, which is training compensation, was said, if I'm not mistaken, 80,000 or something, that it cannot exceed this amount. So when I was trying to understand what is the link between the Article 49, because there were percentages, right? 5%, 5. So there was a matrix of percentage, and this official communication saying it cannot exceed 80,000 or something. I wanted to understand why it is written, it is worded as cannot exceed, and how the calculation is actually being done. But before jumping to this question, can you just bring a light on how much the fees are in the league system of training compensation, which you were just describing to us?
Yes. The payment system between the league regulations and the Portuguese Federation regulations are a little bit different, because the training compensation in terms of the regulations of the league are linked with the proposal that the previous club made for the renewal of the player's sports employment contract. In the league, the training compensation that the previous club, the training club, is entitled to receive shall be no less than 20 times the annual salary of the proposed sports employment contract to the player.
20.
20 times, yes, the annual salary of the proposed sports employment contract.
Isn't it a little bit too high?
I believe yes, but we are talking about professional clubs that are playing in the top leagues in Portugal. So that's why it's a little bit higher than the one that is established for the Portuguese Football Federation, because you have to think about some examples, like a player from FC Porto. That FC Porto trained since the 12 years old, for example. His contract is like ending soon, and FC Porto makes a proposal to the renewal, and Sporting or Benfica comes to the player and make a proposal of a contract with them. I believe that it is important to protect the club that has trained the player, and to give a proper compensation for the training. And this already happened.
In other words, I understood as this amount being 20 times more, 20 times of the annual salary is a regulatory tool to declare within the league full system of, let's say, I don't want to say the word solidarity, I want to say like a tool that if you are acting in the Premier League of Portugal, then you are really in a situation to promote your own players. Otherwise, if you want to engage a player from another club, then you must reconsider your own thoughts for 20 times, something like this. Because
Yeah.
yeah, because why I'm asking this, because we know, right, that the training compensation system is a layer of protection of investment in football, especially at the higher level. The amounts are extremely high, so it's a layer of protection. I fully understand. So what about the RST Portuguese RSTP system, which I asked? How is it being calculated?
So the calculation in the Portuguese Federation regulation, it's different, because it is established an amount for each competition in Portugal. For example, in the first league of Portugal, the amount per year, it's 90,000 euros that will be distributed to the clubs that contributed for the training of the player. For example, for the second league is 40,000 euros, and for the third league is 30,000 euros. They established the amount taking into account the level of the club.
So, in other words, the amounts which were highlighted in the official communication number one,
Mhm.
which I told about,
Yes.
they are being distributed proportionally as set in Article 49, something like this.
Yes, exactly. For
Okay, okay,
this amount for the first league, 90,000 euros will be distributed for the clubs that train the player between uh, 12 years old to 23 years old, and for the clubs that train the player in the seasons of the 12 to 15 years old will receive 5% of the 19,000, and
yeah.
the teams or clubs that train the player between the 16 and 23 years old will receive 10% of that amount. So this is the maximum amount that a club from the Portuguese First League will spend if they sign a first sports employment contract of a player.
So, in case of disputes, is the local NDRC competent to hear the dispute, or is it being submitted to local court? How it's being regulated?
Yeah, in the regulations of the Portuguese Football Federation, there is a specific arbitration committee that can be created in a specific situation to solve the situation. So the club that has participated in the players training process, if the compensation was not paid, they can request to the president of the Portuguese Football Federation the constitution of the arbitration committee, and this arbitration commission will decide the situation, taking into account, of course, the regulations of the Portuguese Football Federation. In my experience, this does not happens a lot. Normally here in Portugal, these kind of compensations normally are paid, or sometimes what happens is that the smaller clubs does not have the resources to know that a player that was trained by that club signed the first employment contract with a bigger club, like a club from the first or the second Portuguese league. And I believe this is why there's not so many discussions regarding the payment, and this arbitration commission is not used many times.
You reminded me about. Maybe you will also remember before the clearinghouse years ago. There
Hmm.
was an application and a website developed by FIFA called GPX or something,
Yeah.
which was tracking the players' movement for these reasons and purposes. But regardless the size of the club, it's basic rule that it's the club's responsibility and obligation, not obligation, but it's club's responsibility and diligence. Let's call it homework. It's
Yeah,
the
yeah.
club's yeah, it's the club's homework to track its own players. So it's up to the club if it has an interest in this or not.
Yes,
But
and nowadays there's a lot of programs that you pay a mensual fee, and they will make the search for you. They will find players that you trained, that the club trained, and will search if they signed a professional contract, or if the player was transferred, to know in terms of solidarity mechanism if the club has to something to receive. But as I said, the smaller clubs sometimes does not have the resources to have this kind of tools. But here in Portugal is really normal and common that smaller clubs may have the right to receive training compensation, because a lot of smaller clubs here have really good conditions, and they form a lot of good players. So from my perspective, I believe if they invest a little bit in these kind of programs, they will have a good return.
My question was deriving from principle of proportionality and disproportionality in training compensation.
Mm-hmm.
We have cast jurisprudence in on this matter, saying that the amount can be adjusted if it's disproportionate, given to the circumstances that the claimant is able to prove that the training costs were more, or if it's a respondent, let's say less in terms of the payment. I would like to know if the same principle of proportionality is it applied in Portuguese domestic regulatory framework, and have you ever encountered this kind of case being submitted to the ad hoc committee you're speaking about or not?
No. As I told you, this arbitration commission is not used a lot. And in my personal experience, I can tell you that I only have one case with this arbitration commission. It was a smaller club that was defend that they were entitled to receive compensation, but they were not entitled because here is a specific thing that I was thinking about telling you forward, is that here in Portugal, for you to be entitled to training compensation in terms of the Portuguese Football Federation regulations, you have to be certified by the Portuguese Federation.
Certified or licensed?
Not licensed. They have a procedure of certification of training entities. So the club has to prove to the Portuguese Federation that they have the conditions necessary to provide to the player the tools and the conditions that the player needs to have a proper training. So if a club is not certified by the Portuguese Football Federation, they will not have the right to receive this compensation.
This is great regulation. I have never thought about this. I will explain you why. Because in practice, I'm not going to say any names, but there are scenarios where the player is registered at some club, but he has never been there actually. He wasn't trained there. He wasn't participating for this team, but formally speaking, he was registered there. And at the end of the day, you see this club trying to make a claim against you, and you sign the player. And obviously, this is unjustified enrichment per se, but this, what you just described, this mechanism is preliminary verification system to ensure that this kind of scenarios are explicitly excluded immediately at the beginning. So this is very great. Yes, this is. I was when I asked you about licensing, at first I was thinking about the regular licensing procedure undergoing for.
Yeah. I understood your question, but this is a specific mechanism, as you said, to avoid this kind of situation you spoke about, and to assure that these clubs, normally the smaller clubs, invest in the conditions to provide the player an environment that allow him to grow as a player. Because here in Portugal, I don't know if in other countries this happens, but here in Portugal nowadays, in the past, no. I used to play football in when I was younger, and in my time when I played, this kind of situation does not happen. But nowadays, you have many clubs that asks the parents of the player to give money and to pay mensual fees to support the costs of the training of the player. For example, with the transportation for the matches, or for the training sessions, for the playing clothes, stuff like that. And I believe that this certification procedure is exactly to avoid these kind of situations and to stimulate the clubs to invest in the formation of players.
Well, if you have the amounts which you told, which I consider reasonable but extremely high, but reasonably high, both in the league system, which is 20 times of the proposal made, and for the RSTP system, which you said about, which we discussed the official communication. If you have this kind of protection, I believe it makes healthy environment for the investment in the youth development football, because the meaning of all this project of this podcast is to find out how this or that country decided to protect this investment in youth football, because we know that youth football, the grassroots, are the fundamentals of professional sports. What we try to do is to try to find out the best practice of good governance within the different countries, and this will make a great example for other countries to implement or to have a methodology to follow for developing the football entirely in different countries as well, because it's not like that we have just an explanation or guide from FIFA or something and everything is good. No, I mean, it's not about that only, because as you said, in different countries, right at the moment when I speak with different lawyers, believe it, like, the domestic regulations are extremely different from one another.
Yeah.
But I suppose training compensation is covered already. What about solidarity? Is there any?
Let me just give an additional input regarding this certification procedure, because at the end of the certification procedure, the Portuguese Federation will make an evaluation of the club's condition and will give an evaluation between 2 to 5 stars. And the clubs that can reach the 5 stars, they will have some benefits that the Portuguese Federation will give them as a prize to have such good conditions. And this system and this evaluation contributes to stimulate the other clubs that had not so good evaluation to improve the conditions and to give more better environment to the players to grow.
So it's an endorsement system also.
Exactly. Yeah. So
Okay,
you were saying to move on to the next topic, right?
yeah, but just before that, a couple of sentences about solidarity contribution system. I suppose it will be similar to FIFA's one, right?
Yes. It's really similar. Here in Portugal, it's really similar. The clubs that hire the player has to deduct from the transfer fee the 5% of the transfer fee and make the distribution to the clubs that contribute to the players' training. The bigger difference between FIFA regulations is that the FIFA regulations change and the calculation it's done by the calendar year.
Yeah,
And here in
from
Portugal,
the season, from the
yeah,
season.
we stay with the season. We make the calculation taking into account the season and not the calendar year. Everything else, it's really similar to the FIFA regulations.
I think that not only Portugal, but many other countries, I would even suspect that the majority of countries didn't adopt this change from the season to calendar.
Yeah.
Yeah, but there is a reason actually. It's not only like a blind decision or negligence or whatever. I will give you my opinion why.
Mm-hmm.
What is the reason that FIFA amended from the season to calendar year? To avoid the situation with the countries where the player was moving from two which have overlapping seasons.
Overlapping, yeah. For
Yes,
example, Brazil. For example,
yeah,
Brazil and
Brazil, Kazakhstan, and many other
Yeah.
countries. But if we are speaking about domestic market, excuse me, you have just one season, regardless. Like, in no way it can overlap with anything else.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
so there is no any reason even to change it.
Yeah, sure.
That's my opinion.
No, yeah,
So
I believe you are correct. Yes, because I believe the main reason that FIFA made that change is because of overlapping seasons. Yeah, and I experienced that a lot because, as you know, Portuguese clubs, the bigger ones, normally hire a lot of players from Brazil, and we had that issue many times.
well, I suppose training compensation is covered.
Hmm.
So we can move to the second question, which is transfer fee types, usually used in the domestic transfers. And in advance, like our so far, we understand that everywhere is the same. I mean, most of the cases includes fixed transfer fees, conditional fees, or sell-on fees.
Exactly.
And one thing that I wanted to highlight before we jump in was about conditional fees. So our previous guest, Luis Hagi Dimitriou, an international sports lawyer who was covering Cyprus,
Hmm.
he told me that recently he saw in a German in a transfer within the German market or to the German market internationally. I didn't ask specifically. He told me that he saw 8 pages of conditional payments. I in my experience, yeah, I haven't encountered 8 pages. I encountered only 1.5 pages of conditional payments performance. I literally have difficulties to understand what can cover 8 pages in conditional payments. But in any case, so if we have this kind of extremely deviating scenario which you experienced, maybe you would like to also speak about, and which is the most common that you experienced in the domestic market about the transfer fee structuring, how which is common in the domestic market.
Yeah, here in Portugal, the transfer fee types depends on the type of club that is buying the player. Normally, if one of the biggest clubs here in Portugal buys a player from a smaller club, the main transfer fee type it's the fixed. You have always a fixed transfer fee, and then sometimes you can have conditional fee or sell on fee, but normally it is a fixed fee. When you have a biggest club selling a player to a smaller one, it happens many times that you don't have a fixed transfer fee because the bigger club, if it's selling the player to a smaller one, is because the player does not count for that for the bigger club, and normally the smaller clubs don't have the resources to pay a fixed compensation for the transfer. So normally what is negotiated is sell-on fees or some share of the economic rights, for example, or even a right of preference in the next transfer of the player. Because the idea of the bigger clubs in this kind of negotiation is to give the opportunity to the player to have more time playing, to allow the player to reborn, let's say this way. And maybe if everything goes well, the player can be transferred again from the smaller club to a bigger club, and then the club that sell the player can have the return. I believe it's
What you were just speaking about is the buyback option, right?
yeah, the buyback option, exactly. Yeah, you
What
have.
i- what what is your opinion on the buyback option from the legal perspective? Is there do you find it controversial or not?
Yes, I believe it's a little bit controversial, but I believe it's not contrary to the third party influence on a transfer, because the club that have the registration of the player, if it's negotiation a transfer to a third club, is because the club wants to sell the player, and the buyback or the one that I was speaking about, the right of preference, is that the club can buy the player back, but for the amount that the club is negotiation with the third club.
I
And of course, it depends always if the player wants to move to the club or not. So
So you just literally covered the next question, which I was going to ask you about this topic, because we were discussing this in the previous episode, and which will be uploaded relatively soon. But there is a small moment in the buyback options and TPI rule. I also agree with your opinion if the text is very plain without binding conditions. But I suppose if there is a binding condition for all of the parties to follow, connected with the minimum amount of the transfer fee. In other words, if the transfer agreement has a wording that if the new club receives, like the former club shall be obliged to pay not less than X amount or something like this, and everybody will be bound by this condition, I suppose there is a thin line for the TPI violation, because in this case, the former club has an influence on sports planning of the future club, of the new club. So in this case, it can be to some extent be a subject to disciplinary proceedings. So it is extremely important to review the wording and try to keep it as simple as possible without any complicated conditions being there. So it's very
I
yeah. So
totally agree. I totally agree with what you are saying. Yeah, I was the reference that I made is the right of preference. Is not like the wording
yes,
the wording that you referred. I agree with you. That can be judged as not legal because of the TPI, of course, because the club that has the registration of the player will be limited in terms of the transfer of the player in the future, because the club can have a proposal of 10 million, but if the clause that was agreed with the previous club established that the club can buy back the player for 3 million, this is clearly influence in the club's possibility of sell the
yeah,
player.
limiting the transfer policy as it says
Yeah,
in
yeah,
RSTP. And
yeah,
I know, and by the way, I noticed your very careful wording of right of preference, not the buyback wording,
yeah, yeah,
but
yeah,
the
yeah.
but the right of preference, which makes difference. I noticed that.
Yes, yeah, 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 yeah.
So what
Exactly.
about what about conditional fees? What have you experienced in your practice?
Yeah, from my experience, the conditional fees are not very usual in our intern market. However, when we sell a player to a club outside of Portugal, it is normal to use the conditional fee. We used a lot regarding the performance of the club that buys the player and the performance of the player. It is normal, not the 8 pages that you spoke
Well,
about,
yeah,
but
well, usually, upon my experience, I noticed that conditional fees are always started to be discussed in the cases where the acquiring club doesn't have enough amount specified to pay as a fixed transfer fee to the former club for this player. And when the negotiation comes to the phase when the acquiring club says, excuse me, the transfer fee which you requested is extremely high, we do not have these resources, then the conditional fees are going to be discussed. Usually it's being done like that, at least in my experience.
yeah, yeah, from my experience too, because the club that is selling the player believes that the player value market is like 10 million, but the club that wants to buy the player cannot pay the 10 million as a fixed transfer fee. And normally, if the player is a really good player, the club that is selling the player does not have any problem to put the fee as a conditional one. But of course, we cannot always preview the performance of a player and the injuries and stuff like that. So
Well, as it is generally summarized, the player's performance is unpredictable.
yeah,
So we do not know how the outcome will be. So it's the risk that the acquiring club undertakes when making the payment. But I want to know your personal opinion on the one of the most discussed case recently, the Aras case.
mhm.
Well, as you may also have noticed already, the views and opinions of different lawyers are extremely different from one extent to another. One say this is going to change the transfer market entirely, the regulations. The other lawyers say that it will not have a big impact on the future. I want to know your opinion, how you foresee this case impacting on the RSTP, or what will happen.
Yeah, I believe it will have an impact, but I believe that FIFA will do what is necessary to protect our industry, because football industry, as you know, is a really specific industry, and this kind of regulations, that this kind of rules that RSTP has, they are really necessary, because nowadays we have clubs with a lot of resources, and the difference between the clubs' financial resources are huge. So we have to have a certain protection to the clubs in terms of stability, because otherwise, as we can see nowadays, clubs from the Arabia, for example, or some England clubs that have a lot of financial resources, if the sports sanctions that are applied in case of they influence a player to terminate the contract without just cause. If these kind of sports sanctions are removed, we will have a lot of clubs, for example, the clubs here in Portugal, they will be exposed to lost some players, because these bigger clubs, in terms of financial resource, can influence a player to terminate the contract without just cause. And if the sanction is only financial, for them it will not be a problem. So I believe that these sports sanctions are really important in terms of protection of the clubs that don't have the same financial resources, and this will promote more competition between the clubs. This is my point of view. Of course, I'm influenced by the reality in which I work.
So let's jump to the third question about standard contract form. Do you have such in Portugal?
No, we don't have a standard form. We have a model that if the clubs want to use, it is possible. But we are not binding to a standard form that is closed. We have some guidelines and some rules that must be respected in the employment contract, but we don't have a standardized contract that we have to follow.
And in, as you mentioned, that there are provisions to comply with, which is similar to Article 18 of RSTP, probably special provisions. Yeah. Do you have some, let's say, deviating special provisions which are, let's say, apart from the ones that are stipulated in Article 18 of RSTP? Do you have other provisions from apart from that, or is just the same?
No, yeah, it is similar here. The collective bargaining agreement for the professional football players that establish the guidelines and the rules that a sports employment contract must include, and there are some basic information like the identification of the parties, of course, the amount of the remuneration, the date on which the contract takes effect, and the duration, the date of the signature. There are really basic and simple conditions that you have to mention on the contract. And then if you have to add some more clauses and to add some other conditions that you negotiated with the player, you can establish, because as you know, nowadays, many players, and the players that normally signed with FC Porto, are players that have FIFA agent and lawyers working with them. So normally the negotiation with this kind of players and agents requires some specific clauses depending on the situation.
Well, I agree with this model which you said, and in my jurisdiction we also have it, that you have a template as a recommendation
Yes.
and have freedom to have your own employment contract, because in many countries which we cover now, in many countries there seem to be a binding employment agreement, and I find that this limit that the FA or the league imposes on the parties is actually abusive in the sense of Article 18 of Swiss Code of Obligations, which actually doesn't provide the parties an opportunity to reflect their true and common intention on the paper, you know?
Yes, yes.
So, in other words, if both parties are put in a condition when they do not have a leverage to specify a wording of the clauses which they want to have agreed between them, this is how can this be called as a true and common intention? If there is a dispute between them, I
Mhm.
suppose one of the parties who will be as a respondent, who will be summoned as a respondent, this party will raise the question that it signed the contract under the limited bargaining power
Mhm.
because it was a standard form enforced by the league, and she, or in case of the club, it would be limited in its performance under the contract. So I do not, let's say, I understand this solution, but I do not agree with this if we are speaking from the perspective of true and common intention of the parties. This is my view.
Yes, yes, I understand that this kind of standard form exists in order to try to protect the smaller clubs and the players that don't have enough resources to be working with lawyers and with FIFA agents, because that way a standard form creates an uniformity and more clarity to these players and to these clubs.
Yeah, but it's the obligation of the party, right? It's your homework to do.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, 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 of course.
So okay, we understand that there are scenarios where there are abuses by the club, etc. But in this case, there are player unions. There are many pro bono activities.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Uh, so the players can have a chance can have an opportunity to apply. At the end of the day, if there is an abuse, this kind of abuse can be challenged. So limiting the whole industry in the sense of depriving from the true and common intention reflection on the paper. I mean, it's not up to me to judge, but it's just my opinion that the parties must be granted freedom to reflect their own true and common intention.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah. I know, and I agree. I believe that it's that we have to make a balance between these different situations. Of course, a standard form of contract will limitate the freedom of the parts to negotiate some conditions of that specific employment contract. I believe that. In my point of view, these standardized contracts or these models can serve as a baseline, but they must be completed taking into consideration the specific case and the negotiated terms.
so I suppose the third question is also covered.
Yes.
Well, yeah, we do not have any questions here left, and I really like the model that you have in Portugal. Seems really flexible. And the fourth question is left for you. What you would like to discuss about
Yes,
domestic jurisdiction?
my idea was to speak about the legal framework that we have here regarding the employment contract, but with the flow of the conversation, already spoke about that in this last topic. I thought about speaking about the law that we have here, the legal framework of the employment contract, and to let you know some of the rules that can be interest to compare with other countries. I don't know if for you it is okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Go for it.
So one of the important rules that we have here is that only minors that have reached to the age of 16 can sign sports employment contracts. So only from 16 years old, a player can sign his first sports employment contract. And of course, in this case, the minor has to sign the contract together with the legal representative. This is normal.
It's very interesting. Right at the moment, I want to tell you how the things work in my jurisdiction.
Uh-huh.
So above 16, the player is ready to sign on his own. But
Really?
between the 14 and 16, and this is also written in the local RSTP.
Okay.
And but between 14 and 16,
Mm-hmm.
you are obliged to bring the player's legal guardians as a party to sign, and they by default are acting as an intermediary in the transaction of the employment agreement.
Okay. But in your jurisdiction, a player with 14 years old can already sign an employment contract?
Yeah, but there are many limitations on the working hours, on the conditions. So it's
Okay.
not just like you can just take the 14 years old and put him on the first team. No, there are many, many limitations on that. But
Okay.
mainly, this is rarely used, to be honest, but it's being done only for the sake of protection, of safeguarding the player at the professional level. Because in my jurisdiction, we have also training compensation of the transfers of youth players, not only professional subsequent transfer, but there's also amateur subsequent transfers who
Mm-hmm.
have these clauses. But in any case, some clubs also decide to sign scholarship agreements with young players, safeguarding the compensation at the later stage if the player refuses to sign with them an employment contract. Also, in this case, the guardian participates in the contract. So it depends, but the general rule is that, yeah, above 16 years old, the player is able to sign on his own. So, but
Okay.
but
Here,
this
here,
is yeah,
no, yeah, here in Portugal, between the ages of 14 until 18, we have a different kind of contract. We have sports training contract, and the player after 16 can sign a sports employment contract too. But before 16 years old, that the only agreement that the player can sign it's a sports training contract. That is a little bit different than the.
but my following question will be the contract that you mentioned. Does it have salary to the extent to convert the player's status from amateur to professional within the sense of Article 2 of RSTP, I mean?
The sports training contract, you does not pay a salary to the player. You give like a subsidy,
Scholarship.
yeah,
Scholarship.
scholarship, yeah, to help the player with buying the books for the school, the expenses that the player have in school and by playing football.
But does it limit the player to sign an employment contract elsewhere?
Yes, of course. When the player has this sports training contract, the player cannot sign other contracts with other clubs. However, there is a specific rule that in this kind of contracts, the player can terminate the contract without just cause, with just simply by sending a letter to the club 30 days before the date that the player wants to terminate the contract. So this sports training contract does not give protection to the club.
Finally, I want to know your opinion about a small controversial topic. You know the FFAR at the moment, right? So, what's your opinion between the distinguishment of the football agent and the sports lawyer? What I try to ask. Let me jump to the point. So, right now, when somebody represents a player in front of you, obviously you are going to ask about the license, correct? Correct.
Yeah.
As an intermediary. But
Mm.
what if you receive a letter from the player's lawyer saying that he is going to represent the player upon the power of attorney given to him, not just a simple mandate, I mean, power of attorney notarized, but a lawyer that has the authority to represent the player in full in relation to the employment relations with the club that doesn't have a license of the agent. Will you accept his competence or not?
It is a really interesting topic and question, and I already thought about it because sometimes we have the sports lawyer basically do the work
Of the
of
agent?
of an agent, of a FIFA agent. They negotiate the terms. They discuss the wording of the contract. They do a lot of work that can be relatable to the FIFA agent. And if you think outside the football industry and the FIFA regulation, and specifically, of course, the FIFA agent regulations, a sports lawyer can do the work that the agent normally does, and can receive the payment not as a commission but as a legal fee.
That's the thing. I wanted to bring you an example from my experience, which is very interesting. I was representing a club in this case.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened? Look, an international lawyer approached to us, but the negotiations went really harsh at the beginning, and sports director wasn't eager to discuss the matters with this lawyer specifically. He was eager to bring the player into the team. I told the lawyer to send us the license to verify the competence, and validly he spoke about the power of attorney being notarized, like everything on point. And I said to him, and he also agreed, what solution was made. So what happened? I told him that, okay, you have the power of attorney notarized, you have the competence, but not in my jurisdiction.
Yes.
So I do not accept your power of attorney within my jurisdiction, because it is not, your power of attorney isn't made according to the laws and legislation of my country. And he said immediately, everything was discussed on the fly, not in a written form. And he said very friendly that if I delegate this part of mine to a person from your country and the player will notarize him in your jurisdiction, will this be enough for you or not? I said, yes, no problem. So what happened? One of the local lawyers contacted me and said that, well, I have the competence, the player is notarized, you know the background. But we said, okay, come, we will discuss, no problem. And everything went flawlessly because he was more flexible. But they had red lines, which they agreed in advance. But what I tried to say, this, I don't want to say to call it clash or whatever, but this small disagreement was being solved in this way, which makes sense,
Yeah.
Yeah, it makes sense. So I from that day I was also thinking about these differences between the FFAR and local jurisdiction in terms of issuing the power of attorney, because as a club you cannot say that you do not comply with your local law entirely in favor of the FFAR. Like, you do not have the freedom to do that, so you must live in a parallel universes at the same time.
Yes.
So,
No, and as I said, it is really interesting because you, as a sports lawyer, you can provide to the player the same service that the FIFA agent provides, in terms of supporting the player when negotiating the terms and when signing the contract and the wording of the contract. Of course, FIFA agents have normally something that the sports lawyer does not have, that is the contacts in the clubs and stuff like that. But nowadays, a sports lawyer that works in this industry for a long time, it will have the contacts too, of course, to respect the FIFA agent regulations.
yeah, and
You have
by
to
the
have
way,
a license.
I'm sure you noticed also in the FFAR, in the definitions, there is a wording that the status of agent, I do not remember by heart, so maybe I may be wrong a little bit, but the essence is the same, that legal consultancy was also included within the framework of FFAR. So, but it doesn't per se the club's liability to follow the local jurisdiction,
Yes,
this is important.
of
So
course.
yeah, so this is very curious thing to think about. And what any other topic? Is there something else? Would you like to spread a light, like competition matters or disciplinary matters, something?
No, I believe in our jurisdiction, that regarding the proceeding of disciplinary matters, there's nothing really that is necessary to bring to the conversation, because it's really standard and normal. I believe we touch every topic that I was thinking about. So
Okay, so I suppose it's time to finalize in this case.
Yes.
And I hope you liked. I
Yeah,
hope you
I
liked.
enjoyed a lot. It was really interesting to have your questions and your inputs and your experience to the conversation, because I learned with you a lot today, and with your experience, it was really good to change ideas and opinions regarding this topic. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Pedro, for coming, and thanks for your kind words. I highly appreciate your feedback. And basically, as we just started this, I suppose that episode per episode, we will make it better. And thanks for your trust and for your acceptance to come and share your experience and your opinion on the domestic regulations. I suppose it's really important for the further development of football in other jurisdictions as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ashot, for the invitation. It was a pleasure to have this conversation and to discuss these ideas with you. It was really good. So thank you so much, and congratulations once again in this project.
Okay, thanks, and have a nice day.
Thank you so
So
much. Have a nice day
keeping
too.
in touch.
Okay, thank you.